On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Ronak Vyas. He's the co-founder and CTO at Lead Bank. We're going to be talking about applying what you have learned. And what does that mean? Obviously, Ronak has a great background as an engineering leader, now CTO and co-founder. We're going to be talking about how he has adjusted all through his career to different problems, identifying first-order problems. He mentioned that leadership skills are constant. It's really about how you apply them. We're going to ask him about that. We're going to talk about focusing on the right things as a leader. Ronak, thanks for being on the show. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Before we start, why don't you tell everyone what Lead Bank does?
So Lead, we're officially known as Lead Bank, but Lead, we are a fintech. We provide banking infrastructure services to other companies, other fintechs mostly, but any company that is building financial products for their customers. We're somewhat unique, and that's reflected in our name, which is we are also an FDIC-insured bank, which allows us to bring together both our technical expertise and our banking and regulatory expertise to help our customers who are building financial products to build them in a more robust and a compliant way. So that's what we do for a living.
Awesome. All right. Fantastic. Sounds pretty darn exciting. We could probably do a whole episode on that. But this one, we're going to be talking about applying what you learn. And I think, as I was reflecting on this episode, we had a conversation beforehand, and obviously in leadership roles, it's a lot about the experience, picking up and adding to your toolbox and continuously, growing that skill set. And I guess having to adjust consistently and constantly to different problems just goes with the flow of being a leader. I guess when you, and somebody can go obviously to your LinkedIn and take a look. I mean, you've been a leader of some great companies, now CTO. When you think back over your career, when you mentioned about adjusting to different problems, I guess talk to us a little bit about what that adjustment is and the dynamic aspect of what those problems have to be in terms of how you're adjusting.
So first, I think every company is unique, even if it's in the same industry. So I've had the pleasure and fortune of working in many different companies in many different industries. But one thing, and this is not a secret, but every company is unique. It has its own culture, how the place operates, what makes it tick. So I think when we talk about adjusting, I think that those are the first things you want to understand: how the company operates, what makes it tick. Also need to understand the business and the customers that we serve as part of that company. Then once you kind of understand and develop that business context and cultural context of what that organization is like, then as an engineer, of course, I focus on engineering systems and look at the systems, why they were designed the way they are designed, how are the processes defined and work the way they work, how they serve the customers that we're being hired to serve. And then you sort of start forming your own opinion of kind of the first order problems you need to focus on solving. So as an example, when I went to Yahoo, I worked on Yahoo Mail, and Yahoo Mail is a very large scale consumer product with hundreds of millions of customers and just tens of billions of transactions hitting the system every day. So you realize, obviously, the first order problems are more about scale and availability, and also doing it at a reasonable cost. Because when you're running that large infrastructure, cost also becomes an important consideration. So really, those are the first order problems that you want to focus on solving. And then I left Yahoo to go to Square. Square is a fintech. The scale wasn't anywhere close to what Yahoo scale was, even though it was serving small businesses and individuals. The scale was very different. But being a fintech, you're in a very regulated domain, which means accuracy and correctness of everything that you do becomes really, really important. And when I fast forward to Lead Bank, which is also a fintech, but us being a bank, I think the expectation of us in terms of accuracy, correctness, compliance, all of that is significantly higher. When you're moving billions of dollars through your systems every day, you still have to account for every penny. Everything must reconcile not just the end of the day, as close to real time as possible, because people are conducting their entire business through your systems. So those are some sort of different ways these companies have operated in different industries. And as an engineer, you have to solve very different kinds of problems.
And I appreciate you highlighting those different scenarios, different problems, different opportunities. You mentioned leadership skills are constant. Obviously, every different environment that you just spoke about, all these different companies, all of them were in different circumstances, different states, different sizes, different scales. When you mentioned the leadership skills are constants about how you apply them, talk to us about that in relation to obviously these dynamic environments.
So, yeah, I mean, as a leader, you add sort of more tools to your toolbox, as I say it. So as you continue to grow in your career, you accumulate quite a few of those. Some of you use subconsciously. It just becomes second nature to you, and it's just part of how you operate on a day-to-day basis. And others you want to be more deliberate about. So one thing I always do as a leader is when I walk into a new situation, new company, I always want to take the time to understand the business, the culture, and as an engineer, of course, the systems, and why everything works the way it does and what makes it tick. And then what are the problems that you see? And then based on that context, you kind of start figuring out how you want to go about solving those problems. But again, when you're new to a situation, I think one thing I always use is you don't want to just claim to know everything, even though they are your opinions and informed opinions and based on your experience. How do you communicate them? How do you bring people along and say, okay, how about, like, do you agree with the problem statement that I see? Here are the things that we should focus on. These are the things we're doing well. These are the things maybe we need to improve. Get sort of buy into the problem first before exploring solutions or suggesting solutions. I think that's important. And in kind of how they manifest themselves. So obviously a big part of a leader's job is to make decisions. Realizing that decisions are obviously, they matter, but not all decisions are equal or equally important. For example, what IDs are used by the engineering team to write their code. Not a decision I need to have a strong opinion on, but what data stores we use and some of the infrastructure. Do we write infrastructure as code, or do we just use the console to make that infrastructure changes? I think those are things you want to set up or be more deliberate about upfront, and those are important decisions. Not all of these are quite one-way doors. A lot of people use the analogy of a one-way door and a two-way door. There are very few true one-way doors, but the cost of kind of undoing or redoing that decision is higher than others. So those are the ones you really want to focus on and be involved in, and make sure you're utilizing your experience and your expertise to help make those decisions.
You mentioned, obviously, there's decisions you need to be involved in, decisions not to be involved in. When you look at the decisions you need to be involved in, obviously you have your direct reports, you have your own stakeholders you're responsible to. How do you balance the decisions in respect to how much information you take on versus, obviously, you also have your own toolbox, your own mind, your own body of experience to leverage? How do you balance it? I guess every decision is different. So generally speaking, I guess is kind of what this question's about, is how do you balance taking in information and yet still being responsible for that final decision?
That's a bit of an art, not science. So I think the understanding of the problem. So depending on the type of the decision, I think that context is really important. Are you talking about solving a customer problem? Are you making a technology choice? Because engineering, generally, there are multiple ways to solve the problem. And what are the trade-offs? What are the pros and cons? Kind of thinking about, but what's the North Star? What's the true problem you want to solve? And what are the considerations? I think that's what you look at. And I always try to think from first principles point of view. So even if one is like somebody presents you information and asks you to make a decision, other times you're reviewing something that is much more defined and you're supposed to provide feedback in helping make a decision. So being able to kind of step back and think about the problem from first principles point of view, I think that really helps guide how I think and decide on what's the best course of action.
When you look at, and obviously, I definitely is an art, not a science, but when you look at the dynamic of obviously, you mentioned there's some decisions that you don't need to be responsible for, involved in. There's others that you do. When you identify a problem that you should be involved in, I guess, to what confidence? This is again more of an art question. I'm very curious about this one, but to what degree of confidence, based on the information you have, do you make a decision, right? And I guess the more consequential decision, the more information you need. But at some point, one of the biggest flaws of most people is we tend to want more and more information before we make a decision. That never, as a leader, works out so well. How do you balance that of knowing you have to make a decision at some point, enough information is enough, and you have to move forward?
Yeah, I think that's the perfect versus good. Like, when do you have enough information to make a good decision? And again, that also depends on kind of the consequences as you see of that decision being right or wrong. Especially when you're working a small company lead, we're a small company startup, so to speak. We need to be very fast and nimble and scrappy. And in the cost of indecision is also a very big cost. So there is no perfect, in my opinion, and that's where your experience and expertise comes in terms of making good judgment calls. And keeping in mind the business context and keeping in mind the potential cost of that decision, both in terms of making a wrong decision or not making a decision. Both have costs, or not making it fast enough. So those are the things that you look at. And I think once you're experienced enough and you have enough expertise in your field, the chances of you making an absolutely terrible decision, and you're also working with a set of other smart people, you're not necessarily making all the decisions in a vacuum on your own. So I think that gives you the confidence to make those decisions, because you know the cost of not making those.
Yeah, it's interesting because I subscribe to the opinion that after a certain amount of experience, you know enough not to go down a route where you will make the critically wrong decision. Obviously, we still can, but you know enough not to go down the path that you will potentially, make a decision that's a one-way door, which I don't believe. One-way, two-way doors, that's a whole different podcast episode. But I think those critical decisions, you get better at it. And hence, you might be able to go faster. And I think the interesting thing that as I listen to more leaders talk, is the speed of that decision and taking on more information from that decision is almost more valuable than trying to finesse the decision or trying to sit back and identify maybe an optimal path, because the real world data points, you can't trump those. I guess, as you have been mentioning the experience, you have more tools in your toolbox. If you did move faster, do you think there's a likelihood that you would make more mistakes, or you just would get data points faster? And I know, again, we're talking a lot of art stuff, but I am curious because that is an interest.
Yeah, my personal bias, again, it's situational, but most often than not, I think making reasonably good decisions, based on collective experience and expertise of your team, and moving forward, and then iterating on it quickly. So most of these decisions are not necessarily binary in the macro sense. So you pick a path, you go, and you give yourself the flexibility to learn and iterate as quickly as possible. And I think you would end up with, because now you're collecting real data, you're not just synthesizing sort of theoretical information, and that helps you iterate faster. So generally, there are always situations that demand more caution, but most often than not, I think doing things iteratively will lend you into a good spot faster, is my opinion. That's how I think about it.
I guess now that you are a co-founder, a CTO, I mean, the decisions ultimately more are your responsibility than anyone else's. When you think back to being an employee in leadership versus now as a co-founder in leadership, maybe highlight, because again, not everyone becomes a co-founder, so it's a little bit different. So even if you're a CTO working for somebody, it's still a little bit different. But highlight some of what that entails through that decision-making lens that we've been talking about.
So, yeah, being a co-founder, this is the first time for me, and it is different. As a leader, generally, if you were a CTO employee versus a CTO co-founder, I think the CTO responsibilities are maybe the same and the accountability is about the same. But as a co-founder, you're also looking at other aspects of the company and the success of the company. You're not, I mean, if you're a competent leader and a CTO in your org, you obviously care about the business and the customers and all of that. But I think this takes it to a new level, and you look at the collective impact, like the overall impact of the company of the decisions that you're making, not necessarily just to your org or just to your team. So that does change your decision making a little bit more. You are much closer to the business. You are also, I think, especially when you're in a smaller company as a co-founder, you have a vision and you have a strong conviction for where you think this company is going to be over a certain period of time. But the path to get there is less certain. It's less clear. Like you might have to make a few detours along the way to get where you think you want to get to, or where you can get. And all of those decisions play an important role in deciding that trajectory of where you go from where you are today to where you want to be. So I think putting those decisions in that context as a co-founder, I think is really, really important.
Absolutely. So you spent several years at VeriSign, several years at Yahoo, and obviously several years at Square. At the time, these were bigger orgs. Like your proximity to the engineering team is different. Just the size of your engineering team you're leading, these are all very different than it is when you're founding a company from scratch. I guess as you kind of have had this opportunity to be a co-founder, in your lens, the distance to engineering has shifted, right? Working from VeriSign, Yahoo, Square to now Lead. Talk to us a little bit about that change, and what does that change mean in terms of like your leadership and what you've learned from that?
Yeah, this is a really interesting and near and dear to my heart. So I believe as you grow as a leader in your career, it's really important to retain your functional expertise. What I mean by that is, in case of engineers, it's your technical skills. You started as an engineer, and then over time you became a leader. But if you're a leader of an engineering org, in my opinion, you should still be a strong engineer. Doesn't mean you do the same thing you were doing 10 years, 15 years ago, as in you were developing systems, you were writing code. Maybe you do different things over time. Maybe you start by sort of disassociating a little bit from the day-to-day, and you focus on the design and the architecture of your systems, etc. But I think retaining that ability to go deep when you need to go deep serves you really well and helps you be successful in different kind of circumstances. So if you're too far removed from technology as you manage larger and larger organizations, if you were to go start a new company like we are doing now at Lead, and I'm the CTO and a very small team to start with, that depth becomes really important. So I think retaining that depth is one that I really care about. How you use it is obviously situational. In large orgs, you generally work through your leaders, both technical and people leaders. I generally like to stay close to the actual work that is happening, but at the right level, and that's something you decide based on your experience. What is the right level of detail you want to understand from your team, and then you can decide what you want to double click on. One of the other things that I also realized is when you do want to remain technically involved, when you are doing a design or an architecture review with your team, it's really important to know how to provide feedback. because of the role that you are in, and the bigger the org, the more impact it has in terms of what you say and how people take your word. So rather than casting opinions, like I have to separate, like, am I talking as an engineer or am I talking as a leader? And when you're talking as a leader, you probably better off asking leading questions. Have you thought about this? How would you think about solving that? How would you solve this problem? What if this happens? Versus suggesting that this is how you solve the problem. Because once you make a suggestion, you might in your mind think that I'm making that suggestion as an engineer, but given your role, it could get interpreted as a decision coming from the top to say, this is how we must solve the problem. So you really want to make sure that you are very cognizant of that, and we are conscious about how you conduct yourself in those situations.
I like it. That's really great advice. I guess a final question. Obviously, you are a founder with a good amount of leadership experience coming into it. If you reflect on your own career, is there anything that you could have maybe added to your toolbox that would have prepared you better for being a co-founder? I mean, you obviously have seen lots of different businesses and different situations, but I am curious, is there something you're like, you know what, this would have helped me be a better founder now if I would have had a little bit more experience or exposure to this?
I think as a co-founder, as I said, I think your involvement and what you're solving for is a little different than what you're solving for as a functional leader in a larger organization or even in a smaller company when you're a functional leader versus a company leader. So I think having a deeper understanding of the business and the macro context in which your company fits or what you're trying to do, how that solves where you fit in the ecosystem. I think having that perspective, having that broad view of where you fit in, who you serve, why do they hire you? At times, obviously, you think about it as an engineering leader. I think as a co-founder, I've had to think about this a lot more than I have. So it's not so much that I wish I had more of that. Of course, you wish you had done more of that in a similar role elsewhere. Let's say if you were a product officer versus a technology officer, I think you would have to do a little bit more of that. Otherwise, you work with your product leaders or product counterparts and the business leaders and get some of that information through them. Having a little bit more direct exposure to that, I think it helps you do your job better.
I appreciate the answer. That's fantastic. And Ronak, I know you got to get back to it. I appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing. If somebody's going to want to reach out to you and just maybe follow up, we obviously talked a lot about leadership. We talked about entrepreneurship and situational leadership components as well. Is there a good way of touching base with you?
Of course, it's simple. Ronak at Lead.Bank. You can reach me anytime.
Okay, man. I appreciate it. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for this episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, please share this episode with somebody that is in leadership, might be considering moving into a founding role, or if you're interested in being a founder. I think this is a great episode to learn a lot from what Ronak has gone through in his experience as a leader and becoming a founder. Talked about solving different types of problems. Talked about how to actually pick the right problem and how much information to take on before making decisions. We covered a lot of ground. It was pretty incredible. So please share this episode with others that might benefit from it. I'd appreciate that. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know. Leave me a review on how the podcast is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.